The stray cat kept scratching the gate. Then a stranger smashed the gate and screamed. Before we begin the surprising story of Mrs. Henderson, have you ever wondered if a seemingly violent act could hide a terrifying truth and unexpected kindness? Get ready for a twist that will make you rethink everything, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and listen to. Discover this entire touching story. The crack echoed dryly, brutally shattering the late afternoon tranquility of the Pleasant Oaks suburb. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson flinched, the rose shears slipping from her trembling hand, clattering onto the stone patio. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment, then pounded in her chest like a trapped bird. What was happening? A car accident? Gunshots? In this neighborhood? Impossible. Then another crash, followed by the sickening sound of splintering wood. Closer this time, right in her yard, Mrs. Henderson, a 72-year-old widow, with neatly bunned silver hair and still sharp eyes, behind tortoiseshell-rimmed glasses, felt a chill crawl down her spine. She gripped the arm of her wicker chair, trying to steady herself, and then a scream, not a scream of pain, but one of rage, almost feral. "Get away!" Mrs. Henderson froze. The sound came from her pristine white picket fence. Her pride and joy where the Elizabeth climbing roses were just showing their first buds. She cautiously took small steps across the manicured lawn towards the sound. Her heart hammered. A burglar, some madman. As she rounded the large rhododendron bush, a horrifying scene unfolded. A tall, strange man, his back to her, was swinging a large club. It looked like an old baseball bat. Repeatedly at her fence, whitewood splinters flew everywhere. A section of the fence, the very spot where the orange stray cat she secretly called Sonny often scratched, was now in ruins. The man was panting, his shoulders heaving. He raised the club again, poised to strike another blow. Stop it." Mrs. Henderson stammered, her voice a choked whisper of fear and anger. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" The man froze. Accessorios, the club still raised above his head. He slowly turned. His face was flushed, scowling, his eyes wild under thick brows. It was a face she had never seen in the neighborhood. He stared at her, not with the surprise of someone caught accessorios, but with a look of intense strain, almost desperation. The club slowly lowered, but he still gripped it tightly. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the man's ragged breathing and Mrs. Henderson's pounding heart. What was happening? Her peaceful home, her safe haven, suddenly and brutally violated. And why Mrs. Eleanor Henderson had lived alone in the charming little house at 12 Primrose Lane in the quiet suburb of Pleasant Oaks for 10 years, ever since her husband Arthur passed away from a sudden heart attack. The house, with its vibrant rose garden that Arthur had painstakingly cultivated, was all she had, left a place filled with memories and a fragile peace. Her life was orderly, somewhat monotonous mornings, tending the roses afternoons, reading or knitting, occasional visits to the town's garden club or tea with a few elderly friends. She was content with that tranquility, though sometimes loneliness would creep in during the long nights. About a month ago, that tranquility began to be subtly disturbed. A stray cat started hanging around her house. It had a brilliant sunset orange coat, but its demeanor was shy and wary. Mrs. Henderson would notice it early in the morning when she went out to deadhead her roses. The cat would sit at a safe distance, its emerald green eyes following her, then slink away. If she tried to approach, the peculiar thing was its fondness for scratching a specific section of her pristine white wooden fence. The section right next to the Elizabeth climbing rose Arthur had loved most. Initially, the regular rasping sound each morning irritated her. Arthur himself had painted that fence, and she always tried to maintain it meticulously. She'd tried shooing the cat away a few times, but it would only dash off for a bit before returning to its favorite scratching post. Gradually, Mrs. Henderson's annoyance gave way to a more complex feeling. The cat's lonely eyes, its perpetually searching air, evoked a vague sympathy in her. She started calling it Sunny in her mind, for its vibrant fur seemed to bring a touch of sunshine to her quiet yard. She even began to notice with a twinge of something missing. If a morning passed without the familiar scratching sound, she'd never been a cat person Arthur had been. He'd had a calico named Patches when they were first married, but after Patches passed, they hadn't gotten another pet. Looking at Sunny, Mrs. Henderson sometimes wondered if she should offer it some food, but she hesitated. A stray was still a stray, and she didn't want to encourage it to stay permanently. Besides, the fence scratching remained an issue. And then that fateful afternoon arrived. The afternoon when the peace of Primrose Lane was shattered by the sound of splintering wood and an enraged scream. The inciting incident was the moment the strange man, whom she would later learn was named Frank, appeared and demolished her fence. That violent act, that scream, completely upended Mrs. Henderson's orderly world. It wasn't just property damage. It was an invasion of her private space, of the sense of security she had so carefully cultivated. When the man turned, looking at her with that strange expression, no longer the ferocity of moments before, her fear was still present, but curiosity and a sliver of confusion began to surface. She couldn't understand it. Why her fence? Why the section Sunny always scratched? And why, after such a brutal act, did he look anguished? "Excuse me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm Frank, the new neighbor down the street. I didn't mean to scare you." Mrs. Henderson was still shaking, but she tried to maintain her composure, her voice sharper than she intended. "Well, why did you do it? Do you have any idea what the police will say about this?" It was a weak threat, but it was all she could muster. She wanted answers. She needed an explanation for the chaos that had just erupted before her eyes. Her initial goal was simple: to understand what was happening and ensure her safety and that of her home. Frank raised a hand to wipe a bead of sweat from his brow, the old baseball bat now propped against the ground like a makeshift cane. Exhaustion was evident on the rugged face of the man, who looked to be in his late 50s. "I know how this must look, Mrs. Henderson. Is it?" He hesitated, as if he'd plucked her name from somewhere. Mrs. Henderson merely nodded, her arms wrapped motivos around herself in an unconscious defensive gesture. "It is, and you still haven't answered my question, Mr. Frank." Frank sighed a heavy exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of the world. That cat, the orange one, he kept scratching right at the rotten part of the fence. He gestured towards the shattered planks. "Underneath that, ma'am, right at the edge, there was a nest of rattlesnakes." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in disbelief. Rattlesnakes right in her yard. She'd lived here for over 40 years and had never seen a snake, let alone a rattlesnake. What, what did you say? I've seen them the last few days when I've been walking by. Frank continued, his voice steady, but with an underlying urgency. A big one, and it looked like there were a few smaller ones. That part of the fence was rotted from the inside, probably from moisture. The cat scratching must have agitated them, or worse, it could have accidentally provoked them. I was afraid they'd get into the yard, or worse, into your house, especially at night. Or if you got too close, my yelling was to make sure the snakes would go deeper into their holes before I could act. And the only way I could think to deal with the nest safely and quickly was to break down that section of fence to get direct access. Frank's explanation was like a douse of cold water. From a maniacal vandal, he had suddenly transformed into an unlikely hero. But rattlesnakes. It seemed too incredible, yet the sincerity in Frank's voice, the unfeigned concern in his eyes, made it impossible for her to dismiss him entirely. "Are you sure?" she asked, a note of skepticism still in her voice. "Rattlesnakes in Pleasant Oaks." "I grew up in Arizona, ma'am," Frank said. "I know a rattlesnake when I see one, and I know how dangerous they can be, especially to children or older folks." A flicker of distant sadness crossed his face at that remark. Then he quickly refocused. "I know I should have knocked and talked to you first, but when I saw the cat scratching there again today and a little one poked its head out, I acted on instinct. I apologize for scaring you and for the damage to your fence." Mrs. Henderson looked at the pile of splintered wood, then back at Frank. If he was telling the truth, then he had just saved her from a lethal danger she hadn't even known existed. But if he was lying, why concoct such an elaborate story? "The nest, where is it now?" she asked, trying to imagine venomous snakes lurking so close, still there under the rotted soil. "I need to dig them out and remove them carefully." Frank looked around. "Do you have a shovel and a large bucket, preferably one with a secure lid?" Mrs. Henderson still hesitated. Calling the police was still an option. But if Frank was telling the truth, the police might not handle the snake nest as quickly as he could, and if they were left there any longer, the thought made her shudder. "In the shed," she said, pointing towards the back of the garden. "Follow me." For the next few hours, Mrs. Henderson watched from a safe distance as Frank worked. He moved with surprising method and care. Using the shovel she provided, he gently loosened the soil and rotted wood around the broken fence sections. She could see the intense concentration on his face. Occasionally, he would pause, listen, then resume. Then she heard a faint slither, and Frank suddenly stepped back. "There we go," he said quietly. But she heard him. He used a long, hooked pole, something he'd retrieved from a tool bag he carried, to gently probe. A triangular head, then a scaly brownish-gray body, slowly emerged. Then a tail with horny segments. The snake wasn't huge, but it was unmistakably a rattlesnake. Mrs. Henderson held her breath. Frank was remarkably calm. He used the hooked pole to gently pin the snake's neck, lifted it, and quickly deposited it into the large plastic bucket she had found. Then he secured the lid tightly. He repeated the process 3 more times. 3 smaller snakes. "That looks like all of them," Frank said, after carefully inspecting the hole. "One last time, a mother and 3 young ones. Lucky we found them before they got bigger or found their way into warmer places, like under your house." Mrs. Henderson felt her legs go weak. She sank onto a nearby stone bench. It was all too much. Sonny the cat, with its seemingly innocuous fence scratching, had inadvertently pinpointed a hidden danger. And this strange man with his initially violent actions was the one who had dealt with it. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say. Frank wiped his hands on an old rag. It's all right, ma'am. I'm just glad I was here at the right time. He looked at the broken fence. I'll fix this for you tomorrow morning. Make it stronger than before. Oh, you don't have to. I want to. Frank interrupted, his tone firm. It's the least I can do after causing such a commotion. As Frank prepared to leave with the bucket of snakes, he said he'd take them to the wildlife preserve on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Henderson called out, "Mr. Frank." She began hesitantly, "Would you care to come in for a cup of tea? To thank you properly." The invitation was a surprise even to herself. But after what had just happened, she felt she needed to do something. Frank looked surprised. A rare smile touched his lips. "That would be very kind, Mrs. Henderson. I'd like that very much." As they sat in Mrs. Henderson's cozy kitchen, sipping Earl Grey tea and homemade ginger snaps, the initial tension gradually dissipated. Frank told her he had recently moved from Phoenix after taking early retirement from his job as a civil engineer. His wife had passed away a few years prior, and he wanted to find a quieter place to live. He'd bought the old Miller house at the end of Primrose Lane, the one that had been vacant for some time. Mrs. Henderson listened, and for the first time in hours, she felt she could breathe normally again. The danger was gone, and the man sitting opposite her was no longer a terrifying stranger. Still, tiny seed of doubt remained. Was the snake story entirely true? Or was there something else he wasn't telling her? And Sonny the cat, where had it run off to? The next morning, true to his word, Frank appeared at Mrs. Henderson's door with a toolbox and several new white wooden planks. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow on the dew-kissed rose petals. The air was fresh and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. Mrs. Henderson had a pot of hot coffee defectos and a plate of blueberry scones ready. She felt a little awkward, but also a sense of anticipation. After the initial shock and the incredible truth about the snake nest, she found herself curious about this new neighbor. He wasn't like the men she usually encountered. There was a directness, even a certain roughness to his manner, but beneath it, she sensed a genuine kindness. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Frank said, his voice sounding cheerier than the day before. "Fine weather for carpentry." "Good morning, Mr. Frank. Please come in and have some coffee before you start." They sat at the small table on her patio, overlooking the garden. Frank complimented her roses, and Mrs. Henderson found herself telling him about Arthur, about his love for this garden. Frank listened intently, nodding occasionally or asking a small question. He mentioned that his wife Sarah had loved lavender, and he was planning to plant a lavender border around his own house. The conversation flowed more easily than Mrs. Henderson had expected. They talked about ordinary things, the weather gardening, the changes in the neighborhood. She learned that Frank had a married daughter in Oregon, and that he video called his grandchildren regularly. He also admitted that he'd been feeling quite lonely since Sarah's death, and that moving to a new place hadn't been easy. That sharing touched Mrs. Henderson. She understood loss and loneliness, She also understood the difficulty of starting over. Pleasant Oaks is a friendly place. She said, "Just give people a little time, you'll see." As Frank set to work repairing the fence, Mrs. Henderson sat in her wicker chair nearby, a book, a Dechayushich, in her lap, though her eyes often strayed to watch him work. He was professional and efficient. The rhythmic sound of his hammer gulpies was steady and reassuring. He didn't just replace the broken planks, he reinforced other sections that looked weak. He even meticulously checked the entire length of the fence for any other signs of rot or damage. By late morning, the job was done. The section of fence that had been a gaping wound the day before was now replaced with new pristine white wood, looking even better than before. "There you go, ma'am," Frank said, wiping his brow. "Good as new." Mrs. Henderson got up and walked over to inspect it. "It's wonderful, Mr. Frank, truly wonderful. I don't know how to thank you enough." "It was nothing, ma'am. I told you I wanted to do it." Frank smiled, a genuine smile that softened his rugged features. Just then, a familiar orange shape timidly appeared from behind the rhododendron bush. It was Sunny. The cat looked left and right, then slowly approached. It stopped a few feet from Frank, tilting its head, its green eyes filled with curiosity. Mrs. Henderson held her breath. Would it be afraid of Frank after what had happened? Frank stood still, unmoving. He slowly lowered himself into a squat, extending one hand, palm up. "Hey there, little fella," he said softly. "It's okay?" Sonny hesitated for a moment, then took a few more steps. It sniffed at Frank's outstretched hand, and then, to the astonishment of both Mrs. Henderson and Frank, the cat rubbed its head trustingly against his leg and began to purr loudly. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "It seems to know you're a good man, Mr. Frank." Frank chuckled a hearty sound. He gently scratched Sonny behind the ears. "Maybe cats do have a sixth sense, ma'am." He looked up at Mrs. Henderson, his eyes warm. "Would you mind if I dropped by occasionally to check if those snakes have returned, just to be sure?" "Oh, not at all," Mrs. Henderson replied, a gentle joy spreading through her. "In fact, I'd be very pleased if you did." That was the turning point. The moment the cat Sonny, the symbol of the initial trouble, became the bridge between two strangers. Mrs. Henderson's fear and suspicion had completely vanished, replaced by trust and a warm sense of human connection. She no longer saw Frank as a threat or an unlikely hero, but as a friend, a kind neighbor. She spontaneously invited him to stay for lunch, and Frank happily accepted. The point of no return was reached when Mrs. Henderson's heart opened to embrace a new relationship, dispelling some of the loneliness that had long enveloped her life. She had shifted from passively reacting to events to proactively building something positive from the wreckage of yesterday. In the weeks that followed, the friendship between Mrs. Henderson and Frank blossomed as naturally as the roses in her garden. Frank visited regularly initially to check for any sign of snakes, but those visits soon evolved into companionable chats. They'd have tea on the patio, sharing stories of their pasts, their families, their joys and sorrows. Mrs. Henderson learned more about Sarah, Frank's late wife, about their love for hiking and quiet evenings spent reading side by side. Frank, in turn, heard tales of Arthur, his humor and kindness, and how he had transformed a barren patch of land into a rose paradise. Sonny, of course, was a constant presence during these encounters. The cat was now completely at ease, lounging accessoire on the sun-drenched steps or weaving affectionately around their legs. Mrs. Henderson had even made him a little bed in an old wicker basket lined with soft fabric, placing it in a corner of the porch. Sonny was no longer a stray. He had a home and two devoted human friends. One Saturday afternoon, as Frank was helping Mrs. Henderson fix a leaky garden tap, he casually mentioned the Veterans Club in the town center. They have a dance on the first Saturday of every month. He said, a hint of hesitation in his voice. I was thinking of checking it out. It's just, I don't know anyone there. Mrs. Henderson paused in her weeding. She knew Arthur had been quite the dancer, and they had spent many enjoyable evenings at dance clubs in their younger years. Oh, I hear it's quite lively, she replied. Arthur and I used to... She trailed off, then smiled. You should go, Frank. You might make some new friends. Frank looked at her, a hopeful glint in his eyes. Would you care to join me, Mrs. Henderson? I mean, if you're not busy. Frank's invitation surprised Mrs. Henderson. It had been a very long time since she'd attended such a social event. The thought was both appealing and a little daunting. But seeing Frank's expectant face, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. All right, Frank, she said. That sounds rather nice. That evening, Mrs. Henderson chose her favorite silk dress, a sea green one Arthur had loved, applied a touch of makeup, and carefully arranged her hair. When Frank arrived to pick her up, he was wearing a neat plaid shirt and pressed trousers. He looked a little nervous, but also quite dapper. The dance was more enjoyable than Mrs. Henderson had anticipated. The music was mellow couples, glided across the floor, and the air buzzed with laughter and conversation. Frank, contrary to his somewhat gruff exterior, was a decent dancer. They didn't talk much, simply moving together to the rhythm. In those moments, Mrs. Henderson felt years younger, her worries seeming to melt away. However, not everything went smoothly. While dancing, Mrs. Henderson suddenly felt a little dizzy and had to clutch Frank's arm. He anxiously guided her to a chair. Are you all right, Eleanor? He asked, using her first name, Sheng Yin with an easy familiarity. I'm fine. She managed to smile. Just a little tired, I suppose. It's been a while since I've been so active. But the incident served as a reminder of her age and health. In the days that followed, she felt weaker than usual. The twinges of chest pain she occasionally experienced seemed to occur more frequently. She tried to hide it from Frank, not wanting to worry him or make him feel guilty for taking her dancing. This was, in a way, Mrs. Henderson's dark night of the soul. Fears about her health, about the fragility of life, and even the fear of being a burden began to creep into her thoughts. She started to limit her outdoor activities, declining some of Frank's invitations for walks with excuses of being busy. She worried that if she showed weakness, Frank might not want to be her friend anymore. This new friendship was too precious to lose. Frank, with his quiet perceptiveness, seemed to sense something was amiss. He didn't press her, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. He still dropped by daily sometimes, just to bring her fresh vegetables from his garden or share an amusing story he'd read in the paper. His silent, patient presence was an unspoken source of strength for Mrs. Henderson. One morning, as she was struggling to bend down and pull out a stubborn weed, the sharp pain in her chest returned more intense than before. She swayed, feeling lightheaded. She reached out, grabbing onto the fence, the very fence Frank had repaired, to steady herself Just then, Sonny darted over meowing in an unusually agitated way, then rubbed insistently against her legs as if trying to alert her. A moment later, she heard Frank's voice call out from the gate, "Eleanor, are you out here?" He had arrived earlier than usual. It was as if some premonition had guided him. Frank hurried into the yard, his face etched with concern, when he saw Mrs. Henderson leaning against the fence, one hand pressed to her chest. Her face pale, Sonny was still meowing around her feet, looking distressed. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Frank rushed to her side, supporting her. I'm all right," Mrs. Henderson whispered, but the pain made it difficult to breathe, just a little tired. Frank didn't believe her. He saw the beads of perspiration on her forehead and the way she winced in pain. "We need to get you to the hospital now," he said decisively, his tone allowing no argument. Mrs. Henderson wanted to protest. She didn't want to make a fuss, to be a bother. But the pain was escalating, and a cold fear began to grip her. She nodded weakly. Without a moment's hesitation, Frank carefully helped Mrs. Henderson to his truck, his old but reliable pickup. Sonny leaped into the back seat, as if unwilling to be separated from her. Frank drove quickly but carefully to the nearest hospital, silently praying. Throughout the journey, he held Mrs. Henderson's hand, trying to offer her some warmth and reassurance. In the emergency room, doctors and nurses quickly attended to Mrs. Henderson. Frank was left to wait outside, his heart pounding. He paced the corridor, occasionally glancing through the small window in the ER door, hoping for a sign. Sonny, confined to the waiting area, let out small, anxious meows. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged. Frank rushed towards her. "How is she, doctor?" The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at Frank. "Mrs. Henderson is stable for now. It was an episode of unstable angina, possibly a sign of a more serious underlying heart condition. Fortunately, you brought her in promptly. Any further delay could have been very serious." Frank let out a shaky breath of relief, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from his chest. "Can I see her?" "In a little while," the doctor said. "We need to run a few more tests, but she's awake and has been asking for you." She smiled. "Your family?" "I presume she kept mentioning a Frank." Frank hesitated. I'm her neighbor?" The doctor gave him a knowing look, a very good neighbor. When Frank was finally allowed to see Mrs. Henderson, she was lying in a hospital bed, looking tired, but more alert. A faint smile touched her lips when she saw him. "Frank," she said softly, "thank you. You've saved me again." Frank went to her bedside and gently took her hand. "Don't say that, Eleanor. I'm just glad I was there." He looked at her, the worry still evident in his eyes. "You have to promise me you'll take better care of yourself, all right?" Mrs. Henderson nodded, tears trickling down her cheeks. "I promise." Sonny, allowed in for a brief moment by a compassionate nurse, jumped onto the edge of the bed, nuzzling Mrs. Henderson's hand and purring contentedly. The presence of the little cat and her steadfast friend brought an immense sense of security and warmth. The greatest danger, a sudden heart attack, had been averted thanks to Frank's quick thinking and devotion, and Sonny's uncanny warning. This was the climax of their story, where friendship and care triumphed over illness and fear. Mrs. Henderson had to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation and further tests. Frank visited every day, bringing flowers from her garden, her favorite books and updates on Sonny, who was temporarily under his care. He told her about the cat's antics, how much it missed her, and how it often sat by her front door as if waiting. The doctors concluded that Mrs. Henderson had coronary artery disease and would need to make lifestyle changes, take medication regularly, and possibly undergo a minor procedure in the future. The news was initially daunting, but Frank's unwavering support helped her find strength. He promised to assist her with everything from grocery shopping and cooking to driving her to follow-up appointments. When Mrs. Henderson was discharged, Frank had a light but nutritious dinner waiting for her at her home. Sonny was overjoyed to see her rubbing against her legs and purring up a storm. The little house once again felt warm and filled with human connection. In the months that followed, Mrs. Henderson's life changed significantly. She adhered strictly to her new diet and medication schedule. Frank became an indispensable companion. They took daily walks in the park together, as per the doctor's advice, gardened together, though she only did light tasks and shared the responsibility of caring for Sonny. Occasionally, Frank's daughter from Oregon would call to check in on Mrs. Henderson, and she felt as though she had gained an extended family. The white picket fence where it all began still stood strong and beautiful. It was no longer a symbol of violation or fear, but a testament to an unexpected friendship and the quiet courage found in ordinary people. The story of the stray cat scratching the fence, the stranger smashing it and screaming, and the dangerous rattlesnake nest became an unforgettable memory, a reminder that sometimes the worst of circumstances can lead to the most beautiful connections. Mrs. Henderson was no longer alone. She had Frank, a cherished friend, and Sonny, the clever cat, who had inadvertently saved her life more than once. Life on Primrose Lane remained peaceful, but now that peace was adorned with laughter sharing and the warmth of human kindness. She realized that even in the twilight of life, unexpected gifts could still arrive, and goodness could be found in the most unlikely of places, sometimes beginning with an act of perceived fury and a scream.
The woman and the orange cat were always together. The truth behind it moved everyone. How does an ordinary house cat react when his beloved owner collapses, alone and helpless, from a sudden heart attack? Marmalade's quick thinking is astonishing, but the truly shocking twist lies in the specific, highly unusual behavior he displayed at the window that defied all expectations and alerted help just in time. Subscribe, like, and listen to this moving story of feline heroism and the unbreakable bond it forged. Clara Peterson believed her life was comfortably settled into its final, quiet chapter. At 71, widowed for over a decade, she inhabited her neat-as-a-pin brick bungalow on Maple Street, with a practiced independence that bordered on solitary. Her days unfolded with reassuring predictability, tending the vibrant flower beds that were the envy of the neighborhood, volunteering Tuesdays at the town library, tackling the daily crossword puzzle with fierce concentration, and enjoying quiet evenings with a cup of herbal tea and a good book. She was friendly with her neighbors, exchanging pleasantries over fences and retrieving misdelivered mail, but she kept mostly to herself, her grief for her late husband Tom, a quiet undercurrent beneath a placid surface. Her constant companion in this quiet life was Marmalade. He was, as his name suggested, a large orange tabby cat of indeterminate origin but considerable presence. Clara had adopted him from the county shelter 5 years prior, not as a cuddly kitten, but as a slightly aloof, fully grown adult cat who seemed as set in his ways as she was. He wasn't overly demonstrative. He didn't twine around her ankles constantly or demand incessant petting. Instead, their bond was built on shared routines and unspoken understanding. Marmalade had his established spots, the sun-drenched patch on the living room carpet from mid-morning until lunch, the back of the sofa where he could survey the garden through the window in the afternoon, and the worn needlepoint footstool near Clara's reading chair in the evenings. He would greet her return from errands with a slow blink and a twitch of his tail, acknowledging her presence without effusive display. He tolerated head scratches on his own terms, and occasionally, especially on chilly nights, would consent to curl up heavily on the foot of her bed, his soft purr a comforting rumble in the darkness. Clara, in turn, understood his subtle communications. The specific meow that meant his water bowl needed refreshing versus the one demanding his preferred salmon-flavored kibble. The flick of his ear that signaled annoyance versus the soft chirp of curiosity. She talked to him constantly, narrating her gardening progress, commenting on the news, sharing memories of Tom. Marmalade would listen, or seem to, occasionally responding with a blink or a soft rumble, a silent confidant in the quiet house. Their life together was a comfortable symbiosis, a gentle rhythm that suited them both. Neighbors often saw Marmalade sitting calmly on the wide windowsill of the front living room window, observing the world go by with regal detachment. Mrs. Gable, Clara's next-door neighbor and a cheerful woman who walked her small terrier Patches, passed Clara's house several times a day, often remarked on it. "There's your handsome sentinel, Clara," she'd call out if Clara was in the yard, "keeping watch over Maple Street." "He thinks he owns the place," Clara would reply with a fond smile. Marmalade from his perch would usually ignore them both, or, in recent months, Clara had occasionally felt unusually tired, a bone-deep weariness that settled in more quickly after gardening or even just climbing the stairs. Sometimes she'd experience a fleeting flutter in her chest or a moment of breathlessness. She attributed it to age, to perhaps overdoing it in the garden. She resolved to take things a bit easier, maybe schedule a checkup with Dr. Evans, but she kept putting it off. She was independent, self-sufficient. Acknowledging potential frailty felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Marmalade, attuned as he was, sometimes seemed to watch her more intently during these moments, his green-gold eyes fixed on her face. But she'd wave away her own concern and his apparent curiosity with a dismissive pat on his head. "Just getting old, Marmalade," she'd murmur. "Happens to the best of us." Their peaceful coexistence felt solid, immutable, the quiet backdrop against which Clara expected her remaining years to unfold. Neither she nor the observant orange cat perched on the windowsill had any inkling that the comfortable rhythm of their lives was about to be shattered, and their quiet bond tested and transformed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The unspoken understanding between them was about to become a matter of life and death. It started as just another Tuesday in late April, the kind of spring day in their Midwestern town that felt full of promise. The sky was a bright, cloudless blue, and Clara's prize-winning tulip stood tall and vibrant along the front walk. After her morning volunteering shift at the library, Clara felt energized, deciding to tackle some overdue wedding in the large flower bed bordering her back patio. Marmalade, following his own internal schedule, supervised from his usual spot on the patio table, occasionally swatting lazily at a hovering bee before settling back into a sphinx-like pose, eyes half closed in the warm sun. Clara worked steadily, pulling stubborn dandelions and loosening the soil around her rose bushes, humming softly to herself. Around mid-afternoon she started to feel it again, that familiar unwelcome fatigue, heavier than usual this time. A dull ache began radiating down her left arm, similar to the muscle strain she sometimes got after strenuous yard work, but accompanied by a strange tightness in her chest, like a band slowly constricting. She paused, leaning on her trowel, taking deep breaths. Just overdid it, she told herself firmly, annoyed at her own lack of stamina. Need to sit down for a bit. She gathered her tools and walked slowly towards the back door, the chest tightness intensifying, making each breath feel shallow. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she stepped inside the cool dimness of her kitchen. She gripped the edge of the counter, waiting for it to pass. Marmalade hopped down from the patio table and followed her inside, letting out a questioning chirp as he rubbed against her ankles, perhaps sensing something amiss in her posture or scent. "I'm all right, Marmee," Clara murmured, trying to reassure them both, though her voice sounded thin, distant. The pain in her chest sharpened suddenly, becoming a crushing weight. Nausea churned in her stomach. This wasn't just fatigue. This was something else, something frighteningly wrong. Panic flared, cold and sharp. She needed to call someone. 911. Dr. Evans. Sarah, her niece who lived across town. Her hand fumbled towards the wall phone near the kitchen table, but her coordination seemed off, her fingers clumsy. The dizziness intensified, the room tilting sickeningly. Spots danced before her eyes. She took a stumbling step towards the phone, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. "Help," she tried to say, but only a faint gasp escaped. The crushing weight in her chest seemed to explode inward, stealing her breath entirely. The floor rushed up to meet her. There was a sickening thud as she collapsed onto the linoleum, her head striking the leg of the kitchen table with a dull crack. Then, only darkness. The silence in the neat brick bungalow abruptly became absolute, heavy, and terrifyingly final. Marmalade, startled by the sudden noise and the unnatural stillness of his human, approached Clara's prone form cautiously. He nudged her hand with his nose, letting out a series of questioning meows, louder now, more insistent. There was no response. He sniffed her face, catching the faint metallic scent of blood from where her head had struck the table, mingled with the alien scent of sudden severe illness. Her usual comforting scent was overlaid with something sharp, alarming. He paced around her, his tail twitching nervously, his meows escalating into distressed yowls. He batted gently at her cheek, then more insistently. Still nothing. Her stillness was profound, terrifying. The steady rhythm of her breathing, the gentle rise and fall of her chest he often rested against while she read, it was gone, replaced by a terrifying lack of movement. Panic began to consume the cat. His world, centered entirely around this quiet, predictable human, had just imploded. The source of his food, his warmth, his security, lay motionless on the floor. Instinct, sharp and primal, warred with confusion. He needed to fix this. He needed her to wake up. He let out a long, mournful yowl, the sound echoing unanswered in the suddenly cavernous silence of the kitchen. He nudged her again, desperately, then began pacing frantically between her still body and the doorways leading out of the room, his feline mind racing, searching for a solution to a problem far beyond his comprehension, but triggering every alarm bell in his system. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a crushing weight, threatening everything he knew. Marmalade's initial panic coalesced into a frantic, instinct-driven need to elicit a response, any response, from his unmoving human. He circled Clara again, meowing directly into her face, his cries sharp with distress. He pawed at her arm, his claws extending slightly, catching on her sleeve, something he never normally did. When even that failed to rouse her, a deeper level of feline alarm took over. The usual source of comfort and security was broken, unresponsive. His instinct shifted. Seek outside intervention. He bolted from the kitchen into the living room, his paws skidding slightly on the polished hardwood floor. He ran to the front door first, scratching vigorously at the wood, letting out loud, sharp yowls. He could hear the faint sounds of the outside world, a distant lawn mower, bird song, the rumble of a passing car. But the thick wooden door was an impassable barrier. No one came. Frustrated, he abandoned the door and raced to the large front bay window, his habitual observation post. This window looked directly out onto Maple Street, and more importantly, onto the sidewalk where Mrs. Gable often walked her terrier, Patches. He leaped onto the wide sill. Normally, he would settle here, a picture of calm, feline dignity, perhaps grooming himself or dozing in a sunbeam. But now his agitation was palpable. He saw her then, Mrs. Gable, ambling down the sidewalk with Patches trotting ahead on his leash. They were heading towards Clara's house. This was his chance. But how to get her attention? His usual quiet presence wouldn't work. Driven by sheer panic and the desperate need to signal the wrongness inside the house, Marmalade began acting entirely out of character. He pressed his face close to the glass, meowing loudly, insistently. Not his usual soft chirps, but urgent, grating cries. He began scratching frantically at the window pane, his claws making sharp, scraping sounds against the glass. He paced back and forth along the narrow sill, his tail lashing, his body tense. In his agitation, he bumped against the small potted violet Clara kept on the sill. It wobbled, then tipped over with a distinct crash, spilling soil onto the carpet below. Outside on the sidewalk, Mrs. Gable paused. She always glanced towards Clara's window, expecting to see Marmalade's calm orange presence. Today was different. She could hear the faint but frantic meowing even through the closed window. She saw the agitated pacing, the desperate scratching at the glass. And then she saw the potted plant fall. "Well, now, that's not like him at all," Mrs. Gable murmured, frowning. Patches, perhaps sensing his owner's concern or hearing the high-pitched cries, let out a soft whine, looking towards the window, too. Marmalade was usually the epitome of feline composure. This frantic display was completely abnormal. Mrs. Gable knew Clara doted on that cat. Something must be seriously wrong to make him act this way. A flicker of unease sparked within her. Clara hadn't answered her phone earlier when Mrs. Gable had called to ask about a garden club meeting, and she hadn't seen Clara in the yard all afternoon, which was unusual for such a fine day. "Something's not right, Patches," she said, her voice tight with sudden worry. "Come on." She walked quickly up Clara's front path. Marmalade, seeing her approach, intensified his efforts, scratching harder, his yowls becoming almost continuous. Mrs. Gable rang the doorbell, waited, rang again, longer this time. Only Marmalade's frantic sounds answered her. She knocked loudly. "Clara? Are you all right in there? Clara?" Silence, except for the desperate cat. Fear clutched at Mrs. Gable's heart now. Clara always answered her door, and Marmalade's behavior. She tried the doorknob. To her surprise, it turned. Clara, usually so careful, must have forgotten to lock it after coming in from the garden. "Clara, I'm coming in," Mrs. Gable called out, pushing the door open slowly. The sight that greeted her made her gasp. Marmalade bolted towards her from the window, meowing insistently, then ran back towards the kitchen, looking back at her urgently. Following the cat's lead, Mrs. Gable rushed towards the kitchen and saw Clara lying motionless on the floor, face pale, a trickle of blood near her temple from where she'd hit the table. Mrs. Gable didn't hesitate. Years of watching medical dramas kicked in alongside genuine panic. She knelt beside Clara, feeling for a pulse at her neck, faint, thready, but there, while simultaneously fumbling for her cell phone in her pocket with shaking hands. She dialed 911, her voice trembling but clear as she gave the address and described the situation. "My neighbor, Clara Peterson, collapsed. unresponsive but breathing. Possible head injury. Hurry. While waiting for the paramedics, Mrs. Gable stayed by Clara's side, speaking reassuringly, though unsure if she could be heard. Marmalade paced nearby, still agitated but seeming to understand that help had arrived, occasionally nudging Mrs. Gable's hand or Clara's still form. He had done it. His frantic, desperate window alarm, born of panic and loyalty, had broken through the quiet afternoon and summoned the help his beloved human desperately needed. The unlikely alarm had been sounded just in time. The arrival of the paramedics filled Clara's quiet bungalow with a sudden, purposeful urgency. They moved swiftly, efficiently, assessing Clara's vital signs, fitting an oxygen mask over her face, checking the gash on her head, asking Mrs. Gable sharp, focused questions about when she'd found her and what she knew. Marmalade, terrified by the influx of strangers and the unfamiliar, alarming sense of medical equipment, darted under the kitchen table, watching with wide, frightened eyes as they carefully stabilized Clara onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics, a young man named Ben, noticed the frantic orange cat peeking out from under the table. "Yours?" he asked Mrs. Gable, nodding towards Marmalade. "No, he's Clara's," Mrs. Gable explained quickly. "He's the reason I found her. He was acting frantic at the living room window, scratching, yowling, and knocking a plant over, completely out of character. I knew something must be wrong." Ben glanced back at the cat, then at Clara being wheeled out. "Good cat," he murmured, a note of respect in his voice. "Lucky for her you noticed." The ambulance pulled away, its siren starting up as it reached the main road, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Mrs. Gable stood in Clara's doorway, feeling shaken. She looked at the overturned plant in the living room, the spilled soil on the carpet, the faint scuff marks on the window pane where Marmalade had scratched. Then she went to coax the trembling cat out from under the table. "It's okay, Marmalade," she said softly, offering a hesitant hand. "She's getting help now. You were a very brave boy." Marmalade allowed her to stroke him, leaning into her touch slightly, though he still trembled. Mrs. Gable found his food and water bowls, refilled them, scooped the litter box, and made sure the back door was secure. She couldn't stay. She had Patches waiting and needed to call Clara's niece, Sarah, but she promised the cat she'd be back to check on him. Locking the front door behind her, she left Marmalade alone again, but this time in a house filled not with the silence of crisis, but the quiet hum of waiting. Clara spent nearly a week in the hospital. The diagnosis confirmed what the paramedics suspected: a significant heart attack, complicated slightly by the concussion from hitting her head when she fell. She drifted in and out of awareness for the first couple of days, hooked up to monitors, hazy with medication. But gradually, the fog cleared. She learned she would need ongoing medication, cardiac rehab, and significant lifestyle changes, but the doctors were optimistic for a good recovery. The damage to her heart, while serious, was manageable, largely because she had received medical attention so quickly. "You were incredibly lucky, Clara," Dr. Adams, her cardiologist, told her gently during a bedside visit. The paramedic said your neighbor found you shortly after you collapsed. Apparently your cat raised the alarm. Quite the story." Clara frowned, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. She remembered the chest pain, the dizziness, falling, then nothing until waking up in the hospital. A cat raising the alarm? She thought of Marmalade, her quiet, undemonstrative companion. How? Later that day, her niece Sarah filled in the details, recounting what Mrs. Gable had told her. "Aunt Clara, Mrs. Gable said Marmalade went absolutely wild at the front window. She walks past every day, you know, and she said he's always just sitting there, calm as anything. But Tuesday, he was scratching the glass, yowling his head off, even knocking over your African violet." Mrs. Gable knew immediately something was wrong inside. She came to check, found the door unlocked, and, well, she found you. The paramedic said if she'd found you even half an hour later. Sarah trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. Clara listened, stunned into silence. Marmalade? Her reserved, slightly aloof Marmalade had done that? The image of him, frantic at the window, desperately trying to summon help for her, flooded her mind. It wasn't just luck that Mrs. Gable had noticed. It was Marmalade's deliberate, desperate action. He had saved her life. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, tears of relief, fear for what might have been, and an overwhelming surge of gratitude and love for the orange cat waiting for her at home. All those years of quiet companionship, the unspoken understanding, it ran deeper than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just her pet. He was her guardian, her furry, four-pawed hero. During her remaining days in the hospital and the subsequent weeks in a rehabilitation facility, Clara's primary motivation was to get back home to Marmalade. Mrs. Gable and Sarah took turns visiting Clara's house daily, feeding Marmalade, talking to him, and reassuring him. He was withdrawn and anxious, they reported, spending much of his time hiding or sitting vigil at the window, waiting. Hearing this only strengthened Clara's resolve. She worked diligently in her physical and occupational therapy sessions, pushed herself to regain her strength, all the while holding the image of Marmalade in her mind. The revelation of his loyalty, his life-saving act, had forged a new, unbreakable strand in the already strong cord that bound them. She couldn't wait to tell him, somehow, how much his frantic window alarm had meant. The day Clara finally returned to the little brick bungalow on Maple Street felt like coming home in more ways than one. Leaning lightly on Sarah's arm, she walked slowly up the familiar path, her heart pounding with a mixture of fatigue and eager anticipation. Mrs. Gable had ensured the house was clean, aired out, and welcoming, even placing a small vase of fresh flowers from Clara's own garden on the hall table. But Clara's focus was singular. As Sarah opened the front door, a streak of orange fur blurred from the living room. Marmalade, who had apparently been waiting just inside, rushed towards Clara, letting out a series of anxious, welcoming meows, more vocal than she had ever heard him be. He rubbed fiercely against her legs, weaving back and forth, his tail held high, vibrating with emotion. Tears instantly sprang to Clara's eyes. Forgetting her doctor's admonitions to take it easy, she sank carefully onto the bottom step of the staircase in the hall and reached out her arms. "Oh, Marmalade," she choked out, her voice thick with tears. "Oh, my sweet boy, you waited for me. You saved me." Marmalade didn't hesitate. He leaped onto her lap, pressing his head insistently against her chest, purring with the force of a small engine. He kneaded her slacks gently with his paws, then simply settled, a warm, heavy, vibrating weight of pure orange devotion. Clara buried her face in his soft fur, inhaling his familiar, comforting scent, holding him tightly. It wasn't just a reunion. It felt like a reaffirmation, a profound acknowledgement of the invisible thread that connected them, now strengthened by shared trauma and undeniable love. Sarah and Mrs. Gable watched from the doorway, their own eyes glistening. Clara's recovery was slow but steady, and Marmalade became her constant shadow, her furry nursemaid. He rarely left her side. If Clara rested on the sofa, he curled up on the cushion beside her. If she sat reading in her armchair, he occupied the footstool, often reaching out a paw to rest on her slipper. At night, he no longer just slept at the foot of the bed. He curled up close beside her pillow, his rhythmic purr a soothing lullaby. His aloofness had vanished, replaced by a quiet, unwavering attentiveness. It was as if the crisis had cemented his role not just as a companion, but as her devoted guardian. Clara, in turn, found her affection for him deepening into something akin to reverence. She never looked at him now without remembering his frantic efforts at the window, the sheer luck intertwined with his fierce loyalty that had kept her alive. She pampered him shamelessly with extra treats and gentle brushing sessions, but more importantly, she talked to him constantly, thanking him, telling him her fears, her hopes, confiding in him as she would have confided in Tom. He became the anchor in her slower, more cautious post-heart attack life. The story of Marmalade's heroism spread through the neighborhood and beyond, largely thanks to Mrs. Gable's enthusiastic retelling. People who had previously seen Clara as just the quiet widow on Maple Street now saw her differently. They saw her walking slowly in her garden, her ever-present orange cat following closely behind or watching from the porch. They saw the palpable bond between them, the easy companionship that radiated a quiet strength. Neighbors dropped by more often, ostensibly to check on Clara, but often bringing a small toy or treat for Marmalade. Delivery drivers made a point of greeting him if he happened to be on the porch. Even children walking home from school would sometimes pause by her fence, hoping to catch a glimpse of the hero cat. The story moved them, a simple, powerful testament to the unexpected ways love and loyalty could manifest, transcending species. It reminded everyone that heroes sometimes come in furry, four-legged forms, and that the quietest lives often hold the deepest connections. Clara and Marmalade became an inseparable pair, a familiar and beloved sight on Maple Street. Their walks in the garden were slow, Clara leaning on her cane, Marmalade padding along beside her. Their evenings were spent in quiet companionship, Clara reading, Marmalade purring on her lap or nearby. The silence in the bungalow was no longer tinged with loneliness, but filled with the comforting presence of shared life, mutual devotion, and the enduring legacy of a frantic moment at a window. The woman and the orange cat, always together, not just because of habit or affection, but because of a debt of life freely given, and a bond forged in crisis, now unbreakable, warming the quiet corners of their shared world and touching the hearts of all who knew their story.